Marcus Hale had long stopped counting the seasons. Inside Greystone State Penitentiary, time no longer flowed in months or years, but in identical mornings, identical meals, identical cell inspections, and identical nights filled with the echoes of metal doors slamming shut. 6 years earlier, a failed escape attempt following an armed robbery had ended with an innocent security guard lying dead. The court had shown little mercy, sentencing Marcus to life imprisonment. Since then, every day had felt like another brick sealing him inside an invisible tomb. At 38, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had once believed he controlled every situation. Prison had stripped away that illusion. The sharp suits and expensive watches of his former life had been replaced by a faded prison uniform, while his carefully built criminal reputation meant nothing beyond the concrete walls. Other inmates knew him as someone who preferred silence over conflict. He kept his head down, avoided gangs, and spent most evenings reading whatever worn books he could borrow from the prison library. Isolation became his greatest punishment. His parents had died years before his conviction. His younger brother refused every attempt at communication, unwilling to forgive the violence that had shattered their family forever. No friends visited. No letters arrived. Even birthdays disappeared without acknowledgement. Marcus gradually convinced himself that he deserved the silence surrounding him. Every Tuesday afternoon, volunteers from a prison outreach organization sorted stacks of letters sent by strangers willing to correspond with inmates seeking rehabilitation. Marcus ignored the program for years, believing no outsider could genuinely care about someone serving life for murder. One rainy afternoon, however, a correctional counselor placed a single envelope on the steel table outside his cell. "You might want to read this," the counselor said simply before walking away. Marcus stared at the unfamiliar handwriting for several minutes before finally opening it. The letter came from a woman named Evelyn Carter. She introduced herself with remarkable honesty. She explained that she volunteered with the outreach program because she believed every person deserved someone willing to listen, regardless of the mistakes that had brought them to prison. She wrote about ordinary things: a small bookstore where she worked, rainy evenings spent reading mystery novels, and her belief that loneliness could become its own kind of prison. Marcus expected pity. Instead, he found kindness. For the first time in years, someone addressed him as a human being rather than an inmate number. He hesitated for nearly a week before writing back. His response remained cautious, revealing almost nothing about himself beyond simple facts. He thanked her for the letter but warned her not to expect much from someone with his past. He assumed the correspondence would end there. Didn't. Another letter arrived. Then another. Weeks slowly became months. Their conversations expanded beyond surface-level introductions. Evelyn never excused Marcus's crimes, yet she asked thoughtful questions about the choices that had led him there and the regrets that haunted him afterward. Marcus found himself describing childhood memories he had not revisited in decades, dreams abandoned long before prison, and the crushing weight of living every day knowing one irreversible mistake had stolen another man's future as well as his own. Evelyn listened without judgment. Her replies were warm but never naive. She challenged Marcus whenever he tried minimizing his responsibility, encouraging him instead to confront his past honestly. That unusual balance of compassion and accountability slowly dismantled the emotional walls he had spent years constructing. Eventually, she requested permission for an in-person visit. Marcus almost refused. He feared disappointing the image she had built through letters alone. Prison had changed him physically and emotionally. The man she imagined no longer existed. Still, curiosity overcame fear. Several weeks later, Marcus entered the prison visiting room under the watchful eyes of correctional officers. Families laughed quietly around plastic tables while children hugged parents they barely recognized. Then he saw her. Evelyn stood waiting near the far wall, dressed simply, holding a small, nervous smile that somehow softened the cold institutional surroundings. Their eyes met through the crowded room, and for the first time since his conviction, Marcus felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath years of guilt and despair. It was hope. Neither of them realized that this first meeting would become the beginning of a relationship neither could fully understand. and that every heartfelt conversation from this day forward would slowly bind their lives together, while an unimaginable secret waited silently beneath the surface. Here's the expanded chapter with exactly 700 words. The memory of their first meeting lingered with Marcus long after Evelyn left the visiting room. As the heavy steel doors closed behind him, the prison no longer felt quite as suffocating. For the first time since receiving his life sentence, he had someone waiting beyond the razor wire, someone who knew the worst parts of his past yet still chose to return. Weeks became months, and months quietly slipped into years. Every Tuesday evolved into the most important day of Marcus's week. He counted the hours until visitation, marking tiny lines inside an old notebook hidden beneath his mattress. The routines of prison remained unchanged, but Evelyn's presence transformed how he endured them. Whenever despair threatened to overwhelm him, another letter arrived filled with encouragement, ordinary stories, and gentle reminders that a person's future did not always have to resemble their past. Their correspondence grew astonishingly personal. Marcus described sleepless nights haunted by memories of the robbery that had destroyed countless lives. Evelyn answered with compassion instead of judgment, encouraging him to accept responsibility without surrendering every remaining piece of hope. During monitored phone calls, they laughed about insignificant moments, discussed books they had both read, and imagined places neither of them expected Marcus would ever see again. The guards gradually noticed the difference. The once withdrawn inmate became calmer, more cooperative, and surprisingly optimistic. He volunteered in the prison library and began mentoring younger inmates who struggled to adjust to incarceration. Several correctional officers privately admitted they had never witnessed such a dramatic emotional transformation. Marcus himself believed Evelyn had rescued him from becoming another forgotten prisoner consumed by bitterness. Evelyn never missed a scheduled visit. Rainstorms, snow, and long drives failed to keep her away. She always arrived carrying the same warm smile that somehow softened the harsh fluorescent lights of the visiting room. They sat across from one another for hours, separated only by institutional rules and constant surveillance. Sometimes they spoke endlessly. Other times silence itself became comforting because neither felt pressured to fill every moment with words. Yet beneath Evelyn's calm exterior, another battle quietly unfolded. Every passing month strengthened her love for Marcus while making one truth increasingly impossible to ignore. She often rehearsed difficult conversations during lonely evenings at home, only to abandon them before they ever reached paper. Countless unfinished letters accumulated inside a locked drawer, each beginning with an apology and ending before the confession could finally be written. Fear always prevailed. She convinced herself there would be another opportunity, another safer moment when Marcus's love would be strong enough to survive complete honesty. Instead, every visit made the secret feel heavier. Marcus noticed occasional sadness in her expression but assumed it reflected the pain of loving someone who could never leave prison. Whenever he asked whether something was wrong, Evelyn simply smiled and changed the subject. He accepted her explanation without suspicion because trust had become the foundation of everything they shared. 3 years after their first meeting, Marcus made a decision. During an especially emotional visit, he reached across the small table, gently taking Evelyn's trembling hands into his own. "I know this isn't the life either of us imagined," he whispered, his voice breaking, "but you've given me something I thought was gone forever. Will you marry me?" Tears instantly filled Evelyn's eyes. For several agonizing seconds, she couldn't answer. Guilt pressed against her chest like an unbearable weight. Every instinct urged her to reveal everything before making another promise. Yet she looked into Marcus's hopeful face and feared losing him forever. With shaking lips, she quietly said yes. Several weeks later, prison administrators approved a modest ceremony inside a secure visitation room. A chaplain performed the service while 2 correctional officers and a prison administrator signed the paperwork as official witnesses. Marcus slipped a simple silver band onto Evelyn's finger, smiling more genuinely than anyone inside Greystone State Penitentiary had ever seen. As they embraced briefly before officers separated them once again, Marcus believed fate had finally rewarded his redemption. Evelyn smiled through tears, clutching her wedding ring as she walked toward the prison exit. Hidden beneath overwhelming love remained a truth capable of destroying everything they had built together. And with every passing day, that secret moved one step closer to being discovered. As Evelyn drove away from Greystone State Penitentiary after the wedding, the silver band on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight. To anyone watching, she looked like a newly married woman leaving the prison where her husband served a life sentence. Yet behind her quiet smile lived a fear that had followed her for years, growing stronger with every mile she traveled home. She loved Marcus deeply, but love could not silence the memories she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. Long before she became Evelyn Carter, she had lived under another name. Those years rarely entered her thoughts willingly. They arrived instead through nightmares, unexpected reflections in store windows, or forgotten photographs hidden inside old boxes she could never bring herself to destroy. Growing up, she had always felt disconnected from the identity assigned to her at birth. Every attempt to explain those feelings was met with ridicule, anger, or complete rejection. Family gatherings became painful reminders that acceptance depended on pretending to be someone she was not. By adulthood, the emotional strain had become unbearable. After years of counseling, private struggle, and difficult decisions, Evelyn began building the life that finally reflected who she believed herself to be. The process demanded extraordinary courage but also enormous sacrifice. Friendships disappeared. Relatives severed contact. Former co-workers whispered rumors that spread faster than truth. Eventually, she packed everything she owned into a small car and drove hundreds of miles away, determined to begin again where no one recognized her history. The new town offered anonymity. She found work at a quiet bookstore whose owner valued kindness more than personal history. Gradually, she rented a modest apartment, formed casual friendships, and embraced the ordinary routines she had once considered impossible. She avoided discussing her past, believing some chapters of life deserved to remain permanently closed. Over time, the silence surrounding those memories became easier to maintain. Then Marcus entered her life. What had started as volunteer work through a prison outreach program unexpectedly became the deepest emotional connection she had ever experienced. Marcus never judged her appearance, questioned her femininity, or treated her with suspicion. He listened, laughed, apologized for his own mistakes, and slowly trusted her with the darkest moments of his past. For the first time, Evelyn believed she was loved completely for the person she had become. That belief made one truth almost impossible to confess. Every letter she wrote carried invisible hesitation. Every monitored phone call contained moments when she nearly spoke the words rehearsed countless times alone. During long drives to the prison, she often promised herself that honesty would finally replace fear. She imagined Marcus becoming silent, confused, perhaps even hurt, but eventually understanding that nothing about her feelings had ever been dishonest. Reality always felt far less forgiving. The moment she sat across from him in the visiting room, his hopeful smile erased her determination. She convinced herself another week would be better. Another visit, another conversation, another opportunity that somehow never arrived. The burden gradually reshaped her behavior. Marcus occasionally noticed her staring into space after moments of happiness, as though joy itself frightened her. When he spoke excitedly about their future together despite prison walls separating them, Evelyn forced enthusiastic smiles while guilt quietly tightened around her heart. She hated herself for withholding the truth from the one person who trusted her without reservation. After their wedding, the weight became even heavier. She removed old documents from a locked storage box one evening and spread them across her kitchen table. Birth records, legal paperwork, faded photographs, and forgotten identification cards reminded her how carefully she had rebuilt every piece of her existence. Several times she reached for the telephone, intending to call Marcus and tell him everything before someone else ever could. Each attempt ended the same way. She hung up before the call connected. Instead, she folded every document back into the box, locked it once again, and placed it on the highest shelf inside her closet. Walking away, Evelyn whispered a promise that honesty would come soon. She never imagined fate had already begun moving against her, And somewhere beyond the prison walls, another person was quietly uncovering the past she believed had been buried forever. Here is the expanded chapter with exactly 750 words. The promise Evelyn had whispered to herself never reached Marcus. Before she could gather the courage to reveal her past, events beyond either of their control began unfolding inside Greystone State Penitentiary. What had remained hidden for years was about to surface through the hands of someone who neither sought forgiveness nor cared about the devastation that would follow. It began on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Marcus returned from his prison library assignment to find a plain white envelope resting on the narrow steel shelf inside his cell. There was no return address, only his inmate number written in uneven black ink. Anonymous mail occasionally circulated through the prison despite strict screening procedures. Most contained insults, false accusations, or cruel attempts to provoke violence between inmates. Marcus barely glanced at it. He tossed the envelope onto his bunk and continued with his evening routine, assuming another prisoner hoped to entertain himself by spreading rumors. Only after lights out, unable to sleep, did curiosity persuade him to open it. Several folded documents slipped into his hands. The first page appeared to be an old legal record bearing a different name alongside a faded government seal. Another contained copies of identification documents from decades earlier. Beneath them rested several worn photographs showing someone Marcus immediately believed resembled Evelyn, though dressed differently and much younger than when they had first met. Confused, he unfolded the final sheet. Typed across the page were only 2 sentences. The woman you married has lied to you from the beginning. Her real identity has been hidden for years. Marcus stared at the words without blinking. Then he laughed quietly to himself. Nice try, he muttered, crumpling the page before throwing everything back into the envelope. He convinced himself another inmate had fabricated convincing paperwork simply to destroy the only happiness he possessed. Prison thrived on manipulation, jealousy, and psychological games. Marcus refused to become another victim. The following morning, however, the photographs returned to his thoughts. Certain details felt disturbingly familiar. The eyes, the smile, the unmistakable curve of Evelyn's face. By evening, he reopened the envelope. This time he examined every document carefully. Dates, legal stamps, signatures, and official formatting appeared authentic. Although many records were decades old, they seemed remarkably detailed. Marcus lacked the expertise to determine whether they were genuine or forged, but uncertainty alone proved enough to disturb his confidence. His peaceful routine quickly unraveled. Night after night, sleep became impossible. He replayed countless conversations with Evelyn, searching for inconsistencies he had previously ignored. Small moments that once seemed meaningless suddenly demanded explanation. Why had she rarely discussed childhood memories? Why had she avoided questions about distant relatives? Why had no family members attended their prison wedding? Questions multiplied faster than answers. During visitation the following week, Marcus studied Evelyn more closely than ever before. She noticed his unusual silence almost immediately. "Is something bothering you?" she asked gently. Marcus forced a smile. "Just tired." The lie tasted bitter. He wanted desperately to hand her the documents and demand an explanation. Yet another part of him feared hearing words that could permanently destroy everything they had built together. Instead, he watched every expression crossing her face, wondering whether guilt hid behind each reassuring smile. The uncertainty poisoned him. Correctional officers soon noticed dramatic changes in Marcus's behavior. He became irritable with fellow inmates, abandoned library duties early, and reacted aggressively to harmless jokes. Minor disagreements escalated into shouting matches requiring staff intervention. Prison psychologists requested additional evaluations after observing his increasing agitation and emotional instability. Marcus insisted nothing was wrong. Inside his cell, however, obsession consumed every waking hour. He memorized every detail contained within the anonymous package. He compared old photographs against recent visitation memories until both blurred together inside his mind. Whenever doubt briefly faded, he reopened the envelope and started again, searching for proof that everything had been fabricated. Instead, Each review deepened his suspicion. The prison walls that had once imprisoned only his body now trapped his thoughts as well. One sleepless night, Marcus spread every document across the small metal desk inside his cell. Staring at them beneath the dim security light, he finally admitted the possibility he had resisted for weeks. If even part of the information proved true, then his marriage had been built upon a secret so enormous it eclipsed every promise Evelyn had ever made. The realization ignited something darker than heartbreak. It awakened humiliation. And before long, that growing obsession would drive Marcus to seek answers from someone willing to uncover the truth, regardless of the consequences waiting beyond it. Humiliation settled inside Marcus like poison. After weeks of staring at the anonymous documents, he could no longer convince himself they were part of an elaborate prison prank. Doubt had already taken root, and every unanswered question fed it until it overshadowed every happy memory he shared with Evelyn. Still, one desperate part of him clung to the hope that someone had forged the records with impossible precision. He needed certainty even if that certainty destroyed him. Among the inmates at Greystone State Penitentiary, rumors traveled faster than official announcements. Marcus knew there were prisoners who maintained secret contact with people beyond the prison walls despite constant surveillance. One of them was Victor Salazar, an older inmate serving a lengthy sentence for organized financial crimes. Victor rarely involved himself in prison disputes, but everyone understood he still possessed connections capable of finding information almost anywhere. Marcus approached him during recreation. "I need someone checked out," Marcus said quietly. Victor studied him for several seconds before replying. "That kind of favor isn't free. I'll owe you." Victor nodded slowly. "Names?" Marcus hesitated only briefly before whispering, "Evelyn Carter." No further questions were asked. Days passed without news. Marcus grew increasingly restless, pacing his narrow cell until correctional officers repeatedly ordered him to sit down. He stopped reading, abandoned conversations, and barely touched his meals. Sleep became impossible. Whenever exhaustion finally overtook him, nightmares forced him awake, each ending with Evelyn smiling while silently hiding something beyond his reach. Nearly 3 weeks later, Victor slipped a folded envelope beneath Marcus's food tray during lunch. "That's everything," he murmured without making eye contact. Marcus waited until lockdown before opening it. Inside were additional copies of legal filings, newspaper clippings, public records, and photographs collected from years earlier. The documents described a legal name change, court proceedings, and medical records confirming that Evelyn had transitioned years before rebuilding her life in another state. None of the papers suggested criminal wrongdoing. They simply documented a past Marcus had never known existed. His hands began trembling. He read every page once, then again, and again. The final document contained a recent photograph taken outside the bookstore where Evelyn worked. Someone had circled her face with red ink. Across the bottom, one handwritten sentence appeared. "She never trusted you with the truth." Marcus crushed the paper inside his fist. His breathing became shallow as every conversation, every letter, every promise replayed inside his mind. He no longer remembered the comfort Evelyn had given him during lonely nights. Instead, he remembered every moment she had changed the subject whenever he asked about childhood memories or distant relatives. What once appeared ordinary now seemed like calculated deception. Love slowly surrendered to humiliation. Marcus imagined correctional officers secretly laughing after every prison visit. He pictured inmates whispering behind his back once the truth became public. Even harmless glances from strangers suddenly felt loaded with mockery. Whether anyone actually knew became irrelevant. His mind transformed suspicion into certainty. His temper deteriorated rapidly. A simple disagreement during breakfast ended with Marcus shoving another inmate across the dining hall. 2 officers restrained him before the confrontation became violent. Days later, he erupted after someone accidentally bumped his shoulder in the recreation yard. His disciplinary record, once remarkably clean, filled with reports describing aggressive behavior and emotional instability. Prison psychologists requested additional evaluations. During each session, Marcus insisted everyone was trying to manipulate him. He described conspiracies that lacked evidence, convinced staff members withheld information while fellow inmates mocked him in secret. The psychologists documented increasing paranoia, obsessive thinking, and severe emotional distress. They recommended counseling and closer observation, warning that unresolved psychological pressure could trigger unpredictable violence. Marcus ignored every recommendation. Instead, he filled notebook after notebook with timelines, names, and questions surrounding Evelyn's past. He compared dates from official records against stories she had shared during years of correspondence. Whenever inconsistencies appeared, no matter how minor, he highlighted them until entire pages became covered in angry markings. The marriage that had once given him hope now felt like an elaborate performance. He convinced himself every smile had concealed dishonesty, every loving word had served a hidden purpose, and every embrace had been built upon a foundation of lies. Reason gradually disappeared beneath resentment, replaced by a single consuming belief. Evelyn had stolen his dignity. By the time another weekly prison visit appeared on the schedule, Marcus had already made one irreversible decision. He would no longer remain silent. The woman he once believed had saved his life was about to face questions neither of them could escape. Inside a visiting room where love and fury would collide with devastating consequences. Here's the chapter rewritten as a 900-word true crime fiction scene that builds the emotional confrontation, avoids depicting the fatal violence, and transitions naturally into the investigation. The decision Marcus had made days earlier remained fixed in his mind as correctional officers escorted him toward the prison visiting room. Every step echoed through the concrete hallway, matching the relentless rhythm of the questions that had consumed him for weeks. The folder containing copied documents rested beneath his arm, worn from being opened countless times. What had once been a symbol of hope had become, in his eyes, undeniable proof of betrayal. On the opposite side of the security checkpoint, Evelyn Carter signed the visitor log with the same quiet smile she wore every Tuesday. She greeted the officers politely, surrendered her belongings for inspection, and passed through the metal detector without hesitation. She looked forward to these visits more than anything else in her life. Although the guilt she carried had grown unbearable, she still believed she would soon find the courage to tell Marcus everything herself. She never imagined that moment had already arrived. The visiting room appeared much as it always had. Families spoke quietly across small tables while correctional staff observed every conversation from fixed positions around the room. Children laughed softly as they colored pictures beside parents they could only visit behind prison walls. The ordinary sounds masked the tension waiting at one corner table. Marcus was already seated when Evelyn entered. She smiled warmly. "Hi," she said, taking her seat across from him. "You look tired. Have you been sleeping at all?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her face with an expression she had never seen before. The affection that usually greeted her had disappeared, replaced by something distant and unreadable. "Marcus," he slowly placed the folder on the table. "I have a question," he said quietly. Evelyn's smile faded. "What is it?" Marcus opened the folder and slid several photocopied documents toward her. "What are these?" The color drained from Evelyn's face. Her hands froze before reaching for the papers. She recognized them instantly. Old court records, legal documents, photographs she believed had disappeared forever. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. Marcus ignored the question. "Are they real?" Silence filled the space between them. Around the room, other visitors continued their conversations, unaware that a marriage was collapsing only a few feet away. Tears slowly gathered in Evelyn's eyes. "I wanted to tell you." Marcus leaned forward. "That's not what I asked." She lowered her head. "Yes," she answered softly. "They're real." The words struck Marcus harder than he expected. For weeks he had hoped the documents were fabricated. Hearing Evelyn confirm them shattered the last piece of certainty he had been clinging to. So everything was a lie? No. Her answer came immediately. "My feelings for you were never a lie." Marcus shook his head. "You married me without telling me who you were. I married you because I loved you, You hid your entire past. I was terrified. Evelyn wiped away tears with trembling hands. I've spent years trying to escape the life those papers represent. Everywhere I went, people judged me before they ever knew me. When I met you, I wasn't trying to deceive you. I wanted you to know the person I had become, not the person everyone insisted I used to be. Marcus stared at her without speaking. I tried so many times to tell you, she continued. I wrote letters I never mailed. I rehearsed conversations during every drive here. Every visit, I promised myself I would finally tell you the truth. Then why didn't you? Because I was afraid. She looked directly into his eyes. I was afraid I'd lose the only person who ever loved me without making me feel ashamed. For one brief moment, Marcus's expression softened. The memory of every letter, every phone call, and every promise flashed through his mind. He remembered the hope she had given him when no one else remained. He remembered believing redemption was possible because she believed it first. Then another thought pushed everything else aside. She never trusted me enough to tell me. His breathing became uneven. I gave you everything I had, and I gave you my heart. You gave me a secret. I gave you love. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. Nearby conversations stopped. Several correctional officers immediately turned toward their table. Marcus, Evelyn pleaded, her voice breaking. Please sit down. We can talk about this. There is nothing left to talk about. She reached toward him instinctively. I never wanted to hurt you. The room seemed to shrink around them. Witnesses later struggled to remember the exact sequence of events. Most recalled only raised voices, officers moving quickly, frightened families pulling children away, and sudden chaos spreading through the visitation area. Correctional staff reacted immediately, issuing commands as they rushed toward Marcus and Evelyn's table. Within moments, emergency medical personnel were called. The visiting room was evacuated. Greystone State Penitentiary entered emergency lockdown. Hours later, investigators photographed the now empty room, while evidence technicians documented every detail left behind. Officers who had witnessed the confrontation gave preliminary statements, each describing the devastating collapse of a relationship that had once seemed impossible inside prison walls. By nightfall, news of Evelyn's death had spread beyond the prison gates. Marcus was placed in isolation under constant observation, saying almost nothing after the incident. Outside, detectives began assembling the pieces of a tragedy that had unfolded in full view of dozens of witnesses, unaware that their investigation would soon uncover not only the truth about Evelyn's hidden past, but also the anonymous letter that had set everything into motion. Here's the expanded chapter with exactly 700 words. By sunrise, Greystone State Penitentiary remained under heightened security. The visiting room had been sealed behind yellow evidence tape, its ordinary tables transformed into a silent crime scene. Officers who had worked there for decades admitted they had never witnessed a tragedy unfold so quickly in a place intended to preserve family connections. Outside the prison walls, reporters gathered at the entrance, while investigators prepared to examine every moment leading to Evelyn Carter's death. Veteran detective Rachel Bennett arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. Known for her calm demeanor and methodical approach, Rachel had investigated domestic homicides, organized crime, and multiple correctional facility incidents during her career. Yet even she recognized that this case carried unusual emotional complexity. A marriage built through prison visits had ended inside the same room where it had grown. Understanding how that transformation occurred would require reconstructing years of trust, fear, and hidden truths. Her first stop was the visiting room. Evidence technicians carefully documented the scene while Rachel studied its layout. The room itself offered no mystery. Security cameras covered every angle, correctional officers had been stationed throughout the visit, and dozens of civilian witnesses had been present. Establishing what physically happened would not be difficult. Understanding why it happened would prove far more challenging. Rachel requested surveillance footage from every available camera. Hour after hour, she reviewed recordings documenting Marcus and Evelyn's relationship over several years. Earlier visits revealed laughter, quiet conversations, exchanged smiles, and unmistakable affection. Officers occasionally appeared in the background, but Marcus and Evelyn rarely noticed them. Their body language reflected patience, comfort, and genuine emotional connection. Then Rachel watched the final visit. The recording showed Marcus placing documents onto the table before Evelyn's expression changed completely. Although the cameras captured no audio, Rachel observed their gestures carefully. Evelyn appeared to explain something through tears while Marcus remained rigid, his movements growing increasingly agitated. Within minutes, correctional officers rushed toward the table as nearby visitors scrambled away in panic. Rachel paused the recording. What changed between those visits? She quietly asked herself. The answer, she suspected, existed long before the confrontation itself. Over the next several days, investigators interviewed correctional officers, prison counselors, psychologists, administrative staff, and civilian witnesses. Their statements consistently described Marcus as cooperative and emotionally stable until recent weeks. Multiple officers remembered noticing sudden mood swings, restless pacing, and angry confrontations unlike anything they had previously seen from him. The prison psychologist provided additional insight. Marcus had attended several mandatory evaluations after displaying increasingly paranoid behavior. Clinical notes documented obsessive thinking, distrust toward others, emotional instability, and persistent beliefs that people were mocking him behind his back. Although counseling had been recommended, Marcus rejected every attempt at treatment. Rachel next examined the letters exchanged between Marcus and Evelyn. Boxes containing years of correspondence revealed a relationship built upon remarkable honesty about Marcus's crimes, regrets, and hopes for redemption. Evelyn's letters consistently encouraged accountability, compassion, and emotional healing. Yet Rachel noticed one striking pattern. Evelyn frequently discussed her present life but rarely mentioned childhood experiences, family history, or life before moving to the state. It was not proof of deception. It was evidence of careful avoidance. Investigators soon turned their attention toward the anonymous envelope discovered inside Marcus's cell. Prison mail logs confirmed the package had entered through regular correspondence channels using false sender information. Someone had deliberately concealed their identity while ensuring the documents reached Marcus shortly before the fatal confrontation. Rachel considered the possibility carefully. Whoever mailed the records almost certainly understood their potential impact. Whether the sender intended violence remained uncertain, but the timing suggested deliberate interference rather than random disclosure. Digital forensic specialists traced photocopy characteristics, mailing locations, and document origins while detectives contacted agencies connected to the decades-old records. Every lead pointed toward someone who possessed detailed knowledge of Evelyn's past and enough determination to resurrect it after years of silence. As Rachel assembled timelines across her office wall, one realization became impossible to ignore. The homicide inside Greystone State Penitentiary had not begun in the visiting room. It had begun with a carefully chosen envelope carrying buried truths into the hands of an emotionally vulnerable prisoner. Finding the person responsible for sending that letter became just as important as prosecuting Marcus, because somewhere beyond the prison walls walked an individual whose hidden motives threatened to reveal an even darker layer of the tragedy awaiting discovery. Here's the expanded chapter with exactly 650 words. Months after the investigation began, the criminal trial opened beneath intense public attention. Television crews crowded the courthouse steps before sunrise, while reporters debated the complicated questions surrounding the case. What had started as a homicide inside Greystone State Penitentiary had evolved into a national conversation about trust, identity, prejudice, accountability, and the devastating consequences of concealed truths. Inside the courtroom, however, the focus remained fixed on one question alone. Who bore legal responsibility for Evelyn Carter's death? Marcus entered wearing prison restraints and a plain suit provided by his attorneys. He appeared older than he had only months before. The anger that once dominated his expression had faded into exhaustion. He rarely looked toward the gallery, choosing instead to stare silently at the defense table. Behind him sat no relatives or longtime friends. Years of incarceration had left him almost entirely alone. Across the aisle, Evelyn's family and a small circle of close friends occupied the first rows. Many still struggled to understand how a relationship that had seemed built upon compassion had ended in irreversible tragedy. They carried photographs of Evelyn smiling outside the bookstore where she had rebuilt her life, determined that jurors would remember her as more than the circumstances surrounding her death. The prosecution began by presenting a carefully organized timeline. Prosecutors argued that Marcus's actions demonstrated planning rather than sudden impulse. They introduced prison records documenting behavioral changes after the anonymous package arrived, testimony from correctional officers describing escalating aggression, and evidence showing Marcus had repeatedly reviewed the documents before the fatal confrontation. According to the state, Marcus had several opportunities to seek counseling, request clarification, or end the relationship peacefully. Instead, they argued he chose violence. The defense offered a different interpretation. Marcus's attorneys acknowledged his responsibility for Evelyn's death, but argued that years of psychological deterioration inside prison had left him emotionally unstable long before the confrontation occurred. They highlighted reports from prison psychologists describing obsessive thinking, severe paranoia, sleep deprivation, and declining emotional control. The anonymous letter, they claimed, had deliberately exploited those vulnerabilities by introducing deeply personal information in the most damaging possible manner. Witnesses described both versions of Marcus. Correctional officers recalled an inmate who had spent years avoiding conflict before changing dramatically after receiving the mysterious envelope. Prison counselors testified about his growing isolation and repeated refusal to discuss the contents of the documents. Medical experts explained how prolonged incarceration, unresolved guilt, and emotional dependency could distort judgment without removing personal responsibility for criminal actions. The courtroom fell completely silent when Evelyn's closest friend, Linda Morrison, entered the witness stand. Speaking through visible emotion, Linda described knowing Evelyn for more than 15 years. She explained that Evelyn had endured rejection from relatives, discrimination from strangers, and constant fear that someone would expose the past she had worked so hard to leave behind. According to Linda, Evelyn never viewed her history as something shameful, but she feared that revealing it too early would cause people to judge her before truly knowing her. She wasn't trying to trick anyone, Linda said quietly. She was trying to protect the life she finally managed to build. Under cross-examination, Linda admitted she had repeatedly encouraged Evelyn to tell Marcus the truth before their marriage. Evelyn agreed each time, yet fear always delayed the conversation. Those admissions revealed painful complexity rather than simple innocence or blame. Closing arguments reflected that same complexity. Prosecutors reminded jurors that concealed information, however significant, could never justify taking another person's life. Defense attorneys urged jurors to consider the psychological collapse that had preceded the crime without excusing the outcome. Both sides acknowledged the profound human tragedy beneath the legal arguments. After days of testimony, evidence, and emotional debate, the jurors left the courtroom carrying questions that extended far beyond criminal law. When they returned with their verdict, Marcus's future would finally be decided. Yet Detective Rachel Bennett understood another unanswered question still remained. The person who had mailed the anonymous letter had not yet faced justice, and discovering that individual's true motive would become the investigation's final, unsettling chapter. Here's the expanded chapter with exactly 650 words. The weeks of testimony had steadily transformed the courtroom into more than a place where criminal charges were examined. Every hearing drew journalists, legal observers, and members of the public hoping to understand how a marriage built on compassion had ended in irreversible tragedy. Outside, television cameras captured endless debates. Inside, grief, outrage, and uncomfortable ethical questions filled every seat, reminding everyone that the law could determine guilt, but could never fully explain the human choices behind it. Marcus Hale entered under heavy security each morning. Dressed in a dark suit borrowed from the defense, he appeared noticeably thinner than he had during his arrest. He rarely spoke except to his attorneys, keeping his eyes lowered whenever photographs of Evelyn appeared on courtroom monitors. Whatever anger had consumed him inside the prison visiting room had given way to a quiet emptiness that even seasoned deputies found unsettling. Across the aisle, Evelyn's family sat together in silence. Beside them was her closest friend, Linda Morrison, who had supported Evelyn throughout the years she spent rebuilding her life. Each day, Linda carried a small framed photograph showing Evelyn smiling outside the bookstore where she had worked. It reminded everyone that before becoming the center of a widely discussed criminal case, she had simply been someone searching for acceptance and happiness. The prosecution began by carefully reconstructing the weeks leading to the confrontation. Prosecutors displayed prison records showing Marcus's behavior changed dramatically after he received the anonymous envelope. Surveillance logs documented repeated disciplinary incidents. Correctional officers described increasing hostility toward fellow inmates, while prison psychologists testified about obsessive thoughts and emotional instability. Yet prosecutors argued those changes demonstrated preparation rather than loss of control. Marcus had repeatedly examined the documents, sought additional information, and arrived at the final prison visit carrying copies of the records. According to the state, those actions reflected deliberate planning. The defense acknowledged Marcus caused Evelyn's death, but urged jurors to examine the psychological decline that preceded the tragedy. Expert witnesses explained how prolonged incarceration, isolation, unresolved guilt, and emotional dependency had eroded Marcus's ability to process overwhelming emotional shock. They emphasized that psychological deterioration could help explain behavior without removing legal responsibility for it. Jurors listened carefully as both narratives unfolded. One portrayed calculated revenge. The other described a man whose fragile emotional stability collapsed after discovering information he believed destroyed the only meaningful relationship left in his life. Neither version erased the devastating outcome. The most emotional testimony came when Linda Morrison walked slowly toward the witness stand. Her voice trembled as she described meeting Evelyn many years earlier, shortly after she had relocated to begin a completely new chapter of her life. Linda explained how difficult it had been for Evelyn to trust anyone because previous experiences had left lasting emotional scars. Rejection from family members, public ridicule, and constant fear of being judged had convinced her that revealing deeply personal parts of her history often meant losing the people she loved. She never wanted to deceive Marcus, Linda said quietly. She wanted him to know her heart before he knew everything else. During cross-examination, Linda admitted she had encouraged Evelyn several times to tell Marcus the complete truth before marrying him. Evelyn always agreed in principle but postponed the conversation, terrified that honesty would immediately end their relationship. Linda wiped away tears before stepping down, leaving the courtroom in complete silence. Throughout closing arguments, attorneys confronted questions extending beyond criminal statutes. Could concealed truths create profound emotional harm? Yes. Could fear explain why someone delayed revealing deeply personal information? Perhaps. Could betrayal, humiliation, or heartbreak ever justify responding with violence? The prosecution answered firmly no, reminding jurors that every individual remained responsible for personal choices, regardless of emotional pain. The defense asked for compassion without requesting absolution, arguing Marcus's mental deterioration deserved consideration during sentencing rather than denial. After several hours of deliberation, jurors prepared to announce their decision. While Marcus waited quietly beside his attorneys, Detective Rachel Bennett remained focused on another unresolved mystery. The anonymous letter that had shattered the marriage still pointed toward someone outside the courtroom, and identifying that sender would become the investigation's final and most revealing challenge. Here's the expanded final chapter with exactly 600 words. Several months passed after the trial concluded, yet the consequences of the tragedy continued reaching far beyond the prison walls where it had begun. Media attention gradually faded, courtrooms emptied, and reporters moved on to newer headlines. For the families left behind, however, healing proved far slower than public interest. Every ordinary day carried reminders of lives permanently altered by one irreversible decision. Evelyn Carter's family struggled through grief together. Although they could never undo what had happened, they refused to allow Evelyn's memory to become defined solely by the circumstances of her death. Guided by Linda Morrison, they established the Evelyn Carter Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to encouraging honesty in relationships, providing emotional support for transgender individuals, and promoting violence prevention within correctional systems. Rather than focusing on blame, the foundation sought to encourage difficult conversations before fear and silence could grow into irreversible consequences. Support groups soon formed under the foundation's guidance. Families coping with rejection found safe spaces to share their experiences. Educational workshops encouraged respectful communication, informed decision-making, and access to counseling during periods of emotional crisis. Volunteers emphasized that every relationship required honesty, compassion, and mutual respect, while also recognizing that deeply personal truths could be difficult to share without fear of rejection. The foundation never suggested that secrecy excused violence or that violence excused secrecy. Instead, it encouraged understanding before conflict became impossible to control. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale remained inside Greystone State Penitentiary. His conviction added another life sentence to the one he had already been serving. Fellow inmates rarely approached him, and he no longer sought conversation with anyone around him. The letters that had once brought hope never returned. During long evenings alone inside his cell, Marcus reportedly spent hours reading the same worn notebook that still contained memories of happier days. According to correctional staff, he spoke very little, accepting the silence that had once frightened him as the natural consequence of his own choices. Detective Rachel Bennett completed the final investigative report nearly a year after the homicide. The anonymous letter had ultimately been traced to a former acquaintance from Evelyn's distant past who acted out of resentment rather than concern. Although investigators found no evidence that the sender intended the deadly outcome, they concluded the deliberate disclosure had ignited an already fragile emotional situation. Criminal responsibility for Evelyn's death remained solely with Marcus. Yet the investigation demonstrated how manipulation, unresolved trauma, and hidden resentment had combined to produce devastating consequences. Rachel placed the completed case file inside the department archives. She had investigated many violent crimes throughout her career, but few had challenged her understanding of human behavior as profoundly as this one. The evidence revealed no simple villains or easy explanations beyond the legal facts. Instead, it illustrated how fear could silence honesty, how unresolved emotional wounds could distort judgment, and how anger left unchecked could overwhelm reason within moments. Standing outside the courthouse one quiet afternoon, Rachel reflected on everything the investigation had uncovered. Truth could be painful. Forgiveness could be difficult. Trust required courage from everyone involved. Yet none of those realities ever justified violence. The tragedy of Marcus and Evelyn became a lasting reminder that secrets may strain relationships, difficult conversations may change lives, and painful truths may test even the strongest bonds. However, choosing understanding instead of rage remains the only path capable of preventing heartbreak from becoming irreversible loss. In the end, countless lives were forever changed not simply because the truth emerged, but because one terrible decision transformed emotional pain into permanent tragedy, leaving behind lessons future generations must never forget.